Welcome to This Week in Virginia. It's delightful to welcome two JMU graduates, and both of them working for nonprofit, nonpartisan news sites that are relatively new. Cardinal News just started July of 21, and it was in 2018 that the Virginia Mercury started, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But Dwayne Yancey, the executive editor of Cardinal News, is a journalist, a playwright, an actor, a baseball fan, and everything else from the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. 4 decades of experience in journalism, including 39 with the Roanoke Times, the last 7 years being his editorial page editor. All kinds of awards over the career, the D. Latham Mims Award, and the Virginia Communications Hall of Fame. And one of my favorite books still, and one of the ones when I first read as I got involved in this is, When Hell Froze Over. And Dwayne, I think that could turn into a good play if you decided to do that. And Graham Moomaw, who, as I said, joined the Mercury in 2019. In addition to JMU, got his master's in journalism at the University of Maryland, worked for the Washington Post as a web producer, the Daily Progress, and then the Richmond Times-Dispatch for 6 years, and now a reporter with the Virginia Mercury. The third person on the screen, in addition to me, is Jim Turpin, who first started working at the General Assembly in 1976 as a legislative assistant, and liked working here so much that he's worked in numerous capacities over the years and continues. He's both a colleague and he's a co-host on today's show. And Jim, let me just turn to you to get us started with the first question.
Okay, I wanted to start. Used to be the media was much more a part of, had more of a presence at the General Assembly. Most of the major dailies had somebody who was there on a regular basis, and that has continued to change. Part of it's the different role of the media, but how does that impact how the General Assembly is covered? Dwayne, yours is on a regional basis, but y'all have some presence. And just the role of the media in the General Assembly. It used to be as much a part of the institution as the legislators.
Well, Graham can probably speak to it on a day-to-day basis, but I can tell you, I mean, one of the reasons that we started Cardinal News, not to disparage my former employer, but was when the Roanoke Times decided it would no longer have a political beat. And that all of the political coverage would come from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, which may be fine coverage, but they're not covering our legislators from Southwest and South Side or our issues. So that was one of the big impetus for us starting. We have a small staff of 2 reporters, but one of those is a full-time reporter in Richmond, which makes us the only news organization west of Richmond with the full-time reporter in the state capitol year round. So our goal has been to, restore the coverage, that this part of the state used to have. Graham can speak to it and how that plays out on a day-to-day basis at the Capitol.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, a big reason I became a reporter is, the belief that democracy only works if people know what the government is doing. And to keep people well informed, you have to have lots of eyes and ears on the State House. So yeah, and I think with the diminished press corps, you just have less people watching, and bills that might have gotten covered in previous years kind of slip through the cracks, and the smaller number of reporters just kind of chase the big story of the day. And as Dwayne said, with less people covering specific regions, it's kind of, the Washington Post and the RTD and the Associated Press, all kind of covering similar stories, and less of the more regional bills and things that are of importance to a particular part of the state, but not necessarily important to, readers in DC or readers in Richmond, that sort of thing. I think the crew of reporters that we have there now is pretty solid, and we do a pretty good job of covering a lot of ground. But and I think we at the Virginia Mercury definitely tried to distinguish ourselves by focusing more on policy and not trying to just chase whatever the big story of the day is. And we don't feel that the world needs a fourth version of the same story if the bigger legacy outlets are doing it. So we try to kind of go our own way and go deeper on some bills that might not have gotten coverage otherwise.
Well, part of my standard stump speech when I go out to speak to civic groups goes like this. I point out that in 1982, 40 years ago, then Governor Robb presented a state budget that was $15.7 billion, considered quite extravagant at the time, I'm sure. The budget that just got passed is north of 160 billion. So we're talking, more than 10 times bigger than it was 40 years ago. But does that mean it gets 10 times as much scrutiny? No, it gets less because there are fewer journalists in Richmond to ask questions about it.
Let me broach another subject. I go back to the Robb era, and by the best of my recollection, there was not as much partisanship in the General Assembly. Dwayne, you've seen it over the years, and Graham, you've seen whatever you've seen. You've been close up to it here recently. Is there more partisanship from your perspectives, and if so, what do you think's caused it?
Yeah, it's definitely, I've only been there for, I think this is my 6th session, but I would say it's the worst I've seen it in my time covering the General Assembly. I think there are several different causes. It's hard to point to any one particular thing, but I think you can't overlook just the intense political polarization that came with the Trump era. Republicans kind of making their standard bearer someone who's willing to throw out all the rules, break a lot of norms, and just kind of sees attacking the other side as kind of the animating principle as opposed to any coherent governing philosophy. And Democrats kind of responded to that in kind by digging in their heels and adopting this attitude that Republicans are now, so off the deep end that we've just got to, can't give them an inch on anything. You've got to just dig in your heels and fight them at every turn. And I think that has trickled down to the State House to some degree. You still see flickers of, the storied Virginia way where we can disagree without being disagreeable and work together for the common good. But I would say the partisanship is definitely on the rise. And I think social media also probably plays a role in it, it sometimes feels like there's this whole different information war happening online that only has kind of a faint connection to the actual bills that are being debated. And in that environment, there's not much incentive for anyone to go on Twitter and say, I think the other guys have a good point. I'm willing to work with them on this. All the incentives are toward just ramping up the fear and loathing of the other side. And, as a reporter, I know I spend way too much time on Twitter, and that can skew my perception of what's real and what's important. And I think, it has to be having an impact on the politicians who really spend a lot of time on Twitter as well.
I would agree with all that. I would also add that you've got what author Bill Bishop has called the big sort of people moving to areas, of like-minded people. So you have far fewer swing areas of the state than you once did. If you go back and look at election returns from the 70s, I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but they're available. You'll find far more localities that were, elections were in the winner would be in the 50% range. You rarely, even something in the 60% range was unusual. And I think maybe you have one or two that would sometimes hit 70%. Now you've got lots and lots of localities that routinely, one party, will hit 70%, sometimes 80%. So, when you have a swing area, you're going to wind up with a Democrat or Republican, but there's going to be someone that, by necessity has to, either appeal to the other side or at least not offend the other side too badly. Now you've got, just lots of, one party districts. And, the reality is the most extreme candidate is going to get the nomination there most of the time, be it on the left or the right. So there's not a lot of, the system is not producing legislators who are going to be inclined to, some measure of bipartisanship. And ultimately, I would like to sit here and blame the politicians, but ultimately, people are to blame for a lot of it too.
And just kind of to build on that idea of the big sword, I think I recently read that we are one of only two state legislatures in the country that have divided political control. You know, you see just fully blue states and fully red states, and we're kind of a rarity in that you have Democrats controlling one chamber and Republicans controlling the other. And because it's by such, you know, small margins in each chamber, I think both parties think they have a realistic chance of winning power in the next election. So everything kind of just more and more bills just feel like they are political in nature and geared more toward the next election cycle, as opposed to trying to reach across the aisle and find common ground and just make good policy.
In my part of the state, Southwest and South side, I think on the House side, there might be one district that is considered a swing district. If you stretch things, you might get a few others, but you know, all the others are going to be one way or another.
Let me build on that. Particularly in the House, we've gone through a generational change. You've got almost half the House has been there 4 to 6 years. We've had 4 speakers in the last 4 elections, including one party change. With redistricting coming, which could well accelerate this. And if you just look at the dynamics in the Senate with the age of a lot of the people in the Senate, what happens to things like the seniority system and institutional knowledge, and just how the body functions? We have a minority leader now that's been there 3 years in the House. Used to be people would spend their entire career and hope they got to be a committee chair. And it has changed the dynamics of the institution. So just where are we in this generational change, and how does it impact the process?
Yeah, I think the House Democrats definitely are maybe the best reflective caucus that getting to the phenomenon you're talking about. And I think, you know, this battle over who their leader should be kind of gets at a lot of those things, and that, you know, they're a very diverse body. They have a lot of new members and people who've only been there a couple years. And I think particularly some of their younger members have this feeling that, you know, when you have power, you have a responsibility to use it as much as you can to advance your priorities. You should not be cautious and try to triangulate for the next election cycle. You should just advance those priorities as far as you can, especially priorities that are important to young people. And I think the leadership fight was about a lot of different things, but I think that was one of the overarching issues that Democrats are trying to hash out behind closed doors. And yeah, I do think if you look at the crop of candidates that are running for the state Senate next year, there's a good chance that that body looks a lot more like the House does, and that, you know, because through the redistricting reform process, the incumbents are no longer protected, and there are now these openings for a lot of younger, new people to run for these seats. The Senate Democrats in particular are probably going to have a lot of new members, and with Dick Saslaw, you know, expected to retire, and other senior Democrats expected to retire, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out and how they decide who their next leader should be. I think it's probably too early to tell exactly, you know, what might happen. We've got to see what happens in the 2023 elections first, but I think some of the tumult you've seen in the House Democrats could be kind of on its way to the Senate as well.
Dwayne, what do you think about that?
Well, I'm certainly not going to, you know, sit here and argue against generational change. That's just very, very natural. You know, so I'm not going to, you know, rail against the tide there. Yeah, I do worry about institutional knowledge. Yeah, with any institution. I mean, I've seen that in journalism. You know, a lot of institutional knowledge lost. Same thing happens in politics. And you know, when you lose that, sometimes you wind up making, you know, the same mistakes over and over because, you know, no one was around to say, hey, you know, we tried this once and it didn't work. And I think, you know, what happens, with all due respect to the lobbying community, if the institutional knowledge is not there in the legislature, it's going to be there in the lobbying community. So, is that a good idea? Well, people can decide on that.
The comparison sometimes made between state legislatures and Congress, and I know over the years, Virginia has tried to pride itself as saying, we're not like Congress, we're not like the other side of the Potomac. And I wonder if, since we've come through yet another budget cycle, with it going right down to the wire, no ability to have a continuing resolution, thank goodness for that. Do you see the process in Richmond being all that different from what's in Congress, or is it becoming more like what we see in Congress?
Well, I think there's definitely been, like we discussed, just an uptick in partisanship that wasn't there before. And, it seems like there are fewer and fewer votes that could go either way, like just fewer surprises, everything that's remotely ideological. It just feels like it's more of a scripted show as opposed to, a real debate on a bill that has a chance of passing. And with the budget, I guess my main takeaway on that is it seems like they're in special session almost all the time. So it raises the question of, is this part-time legislature system working, or do we need to be more like Congress in that we're a full-time legislature? I personally, as a reporter, find there to be the complacency about the opacity of the budget process to be kind of baffling. I covered city halls and county governments before I got on the State House beat, and if two members of a city council tried to say this budget stuff is way too complicated, we're going to go in a back room for 3 months and we're going to hash it out, we're going to give you a deal and you just have to vote it up or down, people would go nuts, and rightfully so. So I think the delayed budget and just the fact that we're almost always, it seems like, in a special session of some sort. The special session we're in now just got continued until September 7th because there's still unfinished business. There's a bunch of bills still in conference that didn't get voted on last week. And what's going to happen to those? I don't know. I've been told they're technically still alive, but for the most part dead. So I think there's a growing focus on that question of, is this part-time system working, or do we need the legislature to be more of a full-time body?
And I think the reality is, while we call it a part-time legislature, it may not be a full-time legislature, but it's not really a part-time legislature either. The idea that legislators go there for, 30, 45, 60 days and then come home the rest of the year. No, I mean, as Graham pointed out, there's always seems to be a special session. And then, there's, action that takes place, in between, committee meetings and whatnot. So, it's not the part-time legislature people imagine. It may not be quite a full-time legislature yet, but it's, I don't know, 2/3, 3/4.
Well,
and yet, let me finish up on that just a second, Jim.
Okay.
And yet, their pay has not increased over decades, which is interesting. I don't know of any legislative assistant who doesn't earn at least twice, if not 3 times, and many of them, quite a few of them, 4 times as much as the legislator does because of the work they do. And yet, with all, Dwayne, as you talked about the budget going way up as it has from the Rob era to now, the increase in the part-time pay has stayed extremely part-time. It could cause me or someone to scratch their head and say, why do they actually run or spend $1 million for a job that's going to pay them less than $20,000? Any thoughts that you all have on that?
I would not want to be the legislator who proposes raising his pay.
Right. That's the problem. That is the problem. And we haven't had a governor do it either. Graham? Graham, you have any thoughts?
I think there are a lot of legislatures who very much feel like they need to be better compensated in order to have it's easy for a lawyer to suspend their law practice for a couple months, but you really having it set up this way where the pay is so low and the staff is so bare bones, it's not really incentivizing, people who work normal jobs, people of more modest means. It's much harder for them to have a realistic shot of serving in the General Assembly than it is for, wealthier people who have a, professional job that they can afford to step away from for several months out of the year.
I was going to ask a related question to what David was saying, but I ran Speaker Howe's first campaign in 1987, and we raised between $30,000 and $35,000 and got 67% of the vote. And you now have people spending $1 million aside for a job that pays $18,000 because the majority may depend on it. And it's really changes, I think changes the tone of the General Assembly.
Yeah, the money's there. And as you were saying, their election may depend on who controls that particular chamber. So it'll be interesting to see.
Or we may be drawing lots again.
Is it true that there's still one court case out there, someone trying to get the House to run again this year? What are you reporters hearing about that?
There are actually two. Paul Goldman is still trying to appeal his case, which has been ongoing for the better part of a year now. And then there's a new case filed by the author Jeff Thomas, who has written several books on Virginia government and politics. And he is making, the same argument that the delayed redistricting process is depriving people of equal representation in the legislature. The federal courts are still hearing it, but the longer it goes, the more I'm hearing from people who are saying, there's just no way at this stage in the game that a court could order new House elections in November, especially since we now have 45 days of early voting. It's just logistically impractical at this point to do it. I don't know if the judges are going to agree with that point, because they seem to have faulted the state for just kind of delaying this, trying to drag this thing out in the hopes of avoiding the issue. But I think that has got to be a consideration for any federal court as to whether intervening is even, you could even realistically give these people the remedy that they're asking for at this stage in the game.
To quote Shakespeare, whatever were done, best were done quickly.
Yes. And certainly, as you talked about, over a year for the Goldman case, the quickness has not been there. Well, each legislative session has its unique and special stories that come out. I'd be really interested in hearing, and our viewers hearing from each of you about what's been one of the special stories that you've written on in the protracted 22 sessions.
I don't know about if I have a special story, just because, like I said, there weren't that many surprises, I wouldn't say, because of all of the things we've discussed. But to me, sort of the big picture story of this was how both parties were going to react to this sudden reversal of fortune from last year's elections, and whether that was going to lead to more working together or just increase acrimony. I guess one of the surprising stories to me was this cycle of petty recriminations about political appointments that kind of began with Senate Democrats saying they weren't going to appoint Andrew Wheeler, who was Governor Youngkin's picked, the Secretary of Natural Resources, which just set off this back and forth of revenge where each side was taking the other side's board appointments hostage, and ended with Youngkin vetoing all of one particular senator's bills just purely to punish that particular senator. That was something I have not seen before. And I think that gets back to a lot of the things we've already discussed, and just the rise of partisanship and just partisan combat being the order of the day down there.
On a more upbeat note, policy-wise, for our part of the state, one of the big deals that was somewhat surprising was the state getting into the business of funding local school construction. which has historically been something it hasn't wanted to do very much. And you saw an unusual coalition of rural Republicans and urban Democrats saying, hey, we need this. And ultimately in the budget that was passed, there was $1.2 billion for school construction. That's a big paradigm shift. It's nowhere near the need. Some studies show we have a backlog of $25 billion in school construction needs. But 1.2 billion is certainly better than zero. So policy wise, that was a big deal. And that was one of the rare instances where you did have Democrats and Republicans working together, or at least some Democrats and some Republicans.
Jim, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
No, I'm good right now.
Okay. The other question that I had is that I wonder, Graham, do you have a question you'd like to ask Dwayne? Dwayne, do you have one you'd like to ask Graham? I know you're not really competitors, but you're both providing a real service of news. Dwayne from Southwest and South Side, or Southern Virginia, however one wants to refer to it. The Mercury, more statewide, but not, as you said, Graham, chasing every story. But before we would close, let me give you a chance just to speak to each other or ask each other a question if you'd rather do that.
I guess I would just ask Dwayne, what has your experience been like making this move from a legacy paper into the nonprofit space? Have there been any sort of challenges or surprises that you've had to overcome? And what's your outlook for the future of Cardinal News?
Our outlook is very rosy. When we started, for a long time, when I was with the paper, I kept wondering, when is the business community going to realize that, something is wrong with the paper, that this is not just a matter of the business cycle being up or down, but we're talking about a permanent shift here in how people consume their news and where advertising dollars go. And we're basically seeing the collapse of the legacy news media. It turns out when we went around to start talking to people, they understood what was happening. They just didn't know what to do about it until we came along with a plan. I remember the very first meeting I had with someone in the business community out here. I had this whole presentation ready on why we wanted to do this, and the person very nicely cut me off and said, "I don't need to know the why. I understand the why. Just tell me the how." Got to sound like a sales pitch for us, but we started with a dozen donors. Now we're north of 1,300. We're expanding our staff. We have a third reporter coming on board next month. We're raising money for more. So, our only problem is, one of capacity. There are only so many people to do so many things, but, people understand, the shift. I think is very remarkable. What you've got here, today you've got two people from nonprofit news sites. This is the way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, looks like we got some stories to be watching out for, and if our viewers are not connected daily to Cardinal News and the Virginia Mercury, it's a shame, but you still can sign up and you can get it, and it's free. And so on behalf of my co-host, Jim Turpin, thank you very much, Dwayne and Graham, for being on This Week in Virginia. Wish you the best and look forward to reading your next stories as well. Thank you.
Thank you.